Hey, everybody. Welcome to our gathering. This is Faith, Identity, and Social Justice here at the Q Christian Fellowship Conference 2021. It feels weird to even say that, but I might just call it 2020 plus one for obvious reasons. We are here, and this aims to be an interactive kind of experience where we're looking at faith, identity, and social justice and how that applies to us as queer people, as allies, as Christians, especially. And so let's do some introductions. Carrie?
Yeah, so we are, you can see information about us on here, but we're also role modeling this for you all. So if you if you want to go ahead and type in any of your identity indicators, any information about yourself into the Q&A section of the Zoom, feel free to do that, and you all can see each other's information as it pops up. But I am a teacher, a student, a friend, an artist, and a child. I am of European descent and I was born in the United States.
And I am a musician, an advocate, a photographer, a son, a leader, Chicagoan, a friend. I am a Black American specifically. I'm a descendant of enslaved Africans specifically. And I live in the United States. And so, yeah, share whatever thoughts you have about what identity markers you have, and do that in the Q&A section.
And also in the Q&A, just as a way to kind of get grounded and get present to each other and to this idea of interacting with each other, you can choose to type it into the Q&A or you can just hold it for yourself. But go ahead and sense into how you're feeling about right now, how you're feeling about conference in general, how you're feeling about this workshop. Any emotion or felt sense words are welcome. And the question is, how do you feel right now? And you can go ahead and drop that into the Q&A as well, and just take a notice of some of the information that your neighbors are sharing into that space. And we're just going to pause for a few moments and take notice of um, what's coming into the space. Who are the folks that are here? How are folks feeling and emoting about being here today? And just notice that there's a lot of different responses to the question about felt sense and emotion. We've got folks who are excited. We've got folks who are feeling isolated, right? And that we're all coming into this space from different places. And just invite that to be part of our consciousness as we move through this workshop together. So as we move into the rest of the workshop today, we just invite you to kind of stay grounded and centered in yourself, and also kind of be aware not just of Darren and I, because we're the heads up here, the little speaking faces on the screen, but really be aware of the other folks that are in the space as well.
And as a reminder, as we walk into the space, as we show up in this space, there may be times where you feel a strong emotion, where you feel like you need to take a break or step away. Do what you need to do for your self care. Take a break. This is being recorded. The slides will be shared later, but we want you to primarily do what you need to do to feel healthy in this time. And Carrie, let me know when you're ready to go to the next slide.
Yep, I think we're ready. Thank you, everyone. So we're going to take a pause in silence to read through the slide that's on the screen right now, and to make the acknowledgement here. Um, so we're going to take almost a minute of silence here to pause and acknowledge where we are, whose land we're residing in. And then this is specific for Darren and I, but Darren will drop into the Q&A slot a link if you want to look up the land that you're in. But for now, I just ask that we take a moment of silence. Thank you. We are grateful to be able to live and work in this land. Okay, so I think we're ready.
All right, so let's talk about for a second of why we're here today. Um, in this workshop, we wanted to create a space for us to explore why social justice, why these things matter to us, both as queer people, as allies of queer people, and as people who are Christian. I know in my own work and in my own experience, I've seen a lot of times where people say, well, the Bible's just about the Bible, and that social justice stuff is extra. And I think we miss a really important opportunity to see what was happening in Jesus' day, what was happening in the lives of those who were recorded in the Bible, as well as seeing how we can apply this in our own lives, how we can live this out. And so we are exploring these relationships between Jesus, God, the marginalized. We are confronting our own biases and prejudices. So often we, especially if you grew up in the U.S. or if you grew up in a Western context, we are pretty much taught to see ourselves as the heroes. We're taught to see ourselves as good. We're taught to see ourselves in ways that sometimes doesn't let us see the bigger picture of what's happening. And so what we're going to do is ask you, as we've already done a few times, we're going to ask you to look at yourself, to look at the things that you have experienced and the things that inform your perspective, and to bring that to this space, to bring all of yourself, not to judge it per se, but more so to say, here's who I am, here's how I fit into this story, so that we can figure out how do we grow together, both as a community and as individuals. Okay, and I'm going to go to our next slide, Carrie.
Awesome. So here's the framework that we're going to be using to have our discussion today. There's three components to this framework. There's being with, which the with is an indicator here. It's the ways in which we are informed by the societies and cultures that we're in, the ways that we are informed by the heritage that we are born into or that we bring with us or that we have inherited. And then it's also the ways in which we're informed by the people that we surround ourselves with. So family of choice, culture of choice, even nationality of choice. So being with is our relationship to others. Being as is our relationship to ourselves. And so that's the way that we understand who we are to ourselves, with ourselves, in our own spaces. And that can be cognitive understanding, that can be emotional understanding, that could be spiritual growth. But it's the beingness of being a human. And then we're going to talk about being that, which is how we enact our authentic selves, how we bring the being as into the space of the being with. So what are the ways in which we walk the walk that authentically shows the who we are in the spaces where there are other people, cultures, nationalities. So that's the being at. So as we move through the rest of this presentation and as we interact with each other, think about the moments where we're talking about relationship to other, relationship to self, and then the enacting of that relationship.
So, how is identity important in relation to social justice? Audre Lorde shares this quote with us that reminds us that we need to bring all the parts of ourselves in, and I'll read it aloud. My fullest concentration of energy is available to me only when I integrate all the parts of who I am, openly allowing power from the particular sources of my living to flow back and forth freely through all my different selves without the restrictions of externally imposed definition. There's a lot to unpack there, and we won't get deeply into it right now. But I want us to be thinking about how do you bring your whole self here? How do those parts interact with yourself? We'll get into some specific experiences that note that, but yeah, let's be thinking about all of ourselves, and also shout out Audre Lorde. They'll bless your life. So, what we like you to do at this point is to write down. Actually, a few of these things have already been done. We've shared things about who we are, but feel free to make a note for yourself if you don't want to write in the Q&A that we're using for chat, but about who you are, a parent, a child, a worker, your religion, your sexuality, your race, your ethnicity. These are all kinds of things that we want you to be mindful of. And sometimes you maybe come from a space where you don't think about that. For example, if you're cisgender, you might not be thinking about your gender most of the time, other than as maybe male or female. But for our friends who are non binary and trans, they've had a lot of time to think about their gender. The same thing if you are white or raced as white according to the U.S. standard, you may never think of yourself as having a race. But if you are black, if you are indigenous, if you are something more specific like a particular ethnicity, then you may have thought a lot about these things. And so, again, just take a moment to reflect, to think about who you are. And if there's something that you thought about as a result of seeing other people's comments, go ahead and maybe name your own identity marker in the chat or in the Q&A.
And if you've already added some of your identity indicators into the Q&A and there's more that you're thinking about here, or there's other aspects of yourself that you want to bring into the conversation or bring into the community today, you can answer more than once. You don't have to just limit yourself to the introductory moment.
And
And
so
we're
I'm
going
gonna just to make sure we can all experience what's happening. I'm gonna name some of what's been written. I won't attach names to it, so hopefully you won't feel exposed too much. But so we've had people naming that they're cisgender women, that they're seniors who are gay. We've had people name what land that they reside on as a part of that land acknowledgement we did. We have people who are joining us internationally, people from Ireland, people from Australia. We've had people name that they are grandfathers, that they are pastors, that they are of German and Australian Austrian, sorry, descent. People naming that they are cisgender, that they're progressive, that they are public health advocates. Um, there are people who are autistic, people who are white, people who are scientists, people who are writers and coaches, people who are non binary, who are feminists, who are seminarians, people who are joining us from New Zealand, people who are students and spouses, people who are in the South in the US, people who are in the North in the US. And so one of the other things that we want to kind of name as we come into the space is that that QCF and our legacy as Q Christian Fellowship has often been very white dominant. It's been very male dominant, cisgender male dominant. It's been very gay dominant. And part of the work that Carrie, myself, and others who are on our board have been doing is to really expand that lens, to name that, to do work that makes it so that what our legacy has been doesn't have to be where we continue to head in the future. And so I, want to extend that personal thanks for the people of color who show up into this space, not knowing what to expect, not knowing what they're going to see. And sometimes having to deal with some microaggressions and so forth. We see you, we hear you, and we're, working to make that different.
Okay. So as we move to the next slide, we're actually going to invite everyone to take a reflective moment, and we're going to take a full 3-minute break to do this, to give folks a chance to really pause and think. So Darren, can you click us to the next slide? Awesome. So as you look at the things that you have brought forward as your identity indicators, the first question is, which of these do you identify with? So you've chosen to share or think privately about some identity indicators, but maybe you don't identify with those indicators. Maybe some of those indicators were given to you by somebody else or another institution. So for example, maybe your race was given to you as a political designation by the government at the moment that you were born, and maybe you reject it, you don't identify with it. Or maybe you identify quite strongly with it, and it's a big part of who you are and how you see yourself in the world. So take a moment to look back now at these identity indicators that you've shared and the ones that you've been thinking about but haven't shared, and think about where and how you identify with them. And then the second part of this personal private reflection pause that we're going to take is the question, can you fully be your whole self? So thinking about the Audre Lorde quote, in all situations. Or are there aspects of yourself that you play up or tone down in different situations? So we're going to go ahead and pause for 3 minutes to allow folks to take reflection time to either think or write or type in the notes on your phone. Just kind of be with these questions for a few minutes. So we're going to take just 30 more seconds to finish up your thoughts as you're reflecting upon how do you or which identity indicators do you identify with, and how you can bring yourself into all situations or not in the world that you're living in. So if you want to take a screenshot of this slide, you can do that. We are going to move forward with our conversation today. Also, at the end of the workshop today, within a few minutes after the closing of the workshop, we will upload all of the slides as a PDF that you can download, and those will be in the Whova in the same place where you clicked to get into the workshop. Okay.
All right. So, one of the things that we wanted to look at in here is our heritage. And this is, if we were to use this illustration of the prism, which I'm loving that it came up in Father Richard Rohr's talk last night with Isaac, like, God makes these moments that things just come together. Carrie and I had a lot of fun while putting this together. So we'll unpack that too. But if you think about a prism where a single beam of what we might understand as white light comes in, somewhere in that prism, that light is spread out into all the colors that we see when it comes out the other side. The spreading out is an effect that happens because it's passing through the glass of this prism. And so when we think about our society, when we think about our influences, when we think about what makes us who we are and what we do, the same thing is happening. There's a dominant mainstream that comes in. We interact with it, it interacts with us, it spreads out. And so what we're looking at in this part of the section is things like our history, our legacy, our family, our personal traits, the things that others have said about us and told us. Those are projections. Societal pressures, cultural scripting, heritage that has been lost, our privileges and our oppressions. These are all things that spread out, that normally we just see it as, okay, this is just who I am. But when you spread it out and start to name these individual pieces that are on this bullet point, you start to see what you've inherited or what your heritage is. And so we don't necessarily have a choice in all of these. We have choices in how we respond to them. But these really do inform how we show up in conversations, how we show up in our society. And so I think about, for me, as a Black man who lives in the United States, things that have been given to me are things like, oh, as a Black man, some people are going to see me as lazy. And so I've pretty much always tried to work extra hard above and beyond, to the point that it's been unhealthy at times, where I think that I have to do so much because I'm overcoming the heritage that society has put on Black people, especially Black men, that we're lazy, that we don't get things done, that we're not motivated. Now, how that becomes a part of me is that people see me as this very hardworking man, but that came from someplace, and it has a result in how I work in the world. And so we want to think about the different traits that have been assigned to us, that have been given to us. What are the ways that women get stereotyped into certain things? What are the ways that people who are affluent get stereotyped? What are the ways that your family has said, well, this is the way we do this in our family? These are all the kinds of things that begin to shape us in different ways, positive or negative. Um, yeah. Carrie, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think something that strikes me about this is as we think about it within the framework, we've inherited a whole lot. And so as that light comes in, that's the stream, this influence stream or the heritage stream that we're talking about. And some of those things have changed who we think we are. The being as we look at ourselves in a particular way, or we have habits, or in psychological terms, we've got these schema, these ways in which, these shortcuts in which we think about things or enact things. And so it could influence our being that. It could influence the way in which we show back up in the world because we're taking it in and giving it back out. Or we can work on cleaning up our insides. We can work on understanding mercy and grace and love. And we can work on self reflection and we can work on authenticity. And then the being that comes out of it is what we choose to enact. It's less driven by the influences. Um, I think that the other piece that I think about quite often as a person of European descent is heritage lost. That the way that race in the United States, I reside here, shows up is in a whitewashing that eliminates not just folks of color, not just BIPOC kind of traditions and heritage, but also has erased a lot of European tradition, a lot of indigenous European tradition and culture and heritage. And so it's something that we're all suffering under that in the same way that we all suffer, not just individually, but collectively under any of the ideologies that come across as bias in our culture. So we're going to move from thinking about kind of our individual heritage, and we're going to think about how it is that we identify that white light that comes in this image, how it is that we identify the cultural streams or the heritage streams or the societal streams that impact us.
So with this slide, there's a lot of detail here, and we want to acknowledge that you may be on a screen or a device where you can't see that well. So if seeing this on screen is a challenge, in the Hoover event description, there's already a worksheet that's available that you can download either on another device or switch over and download on the device you're currently using so that you can zoom in and pinch and see all the details on this. There's a lot here, and what we want to do is begin to apply those things that maybe have seemed kind of floating out there. This gives us a framework to start applying this. This framework is an opportunity for us to look at privilege and oppression in common thought. Each of the spokes on this wheel represent a spectrum of thought. The ones here are mostly isms because we are talking about social relationships in an unjust society. Let's take one spectrum line as an example: language bias. On the top right edge of the line is the word Anglophones. This means that English is preferred. People who can speak English are given preference, better treatment, and trusted more. If we follow that line to the lower left, as it crossed the horizon line down to the phrase English as a second language, we we see how on one end of the extreme is Anglophones, and at the other end of the extreme is English as a second language. We know that people sometimes exist at either end, but there's a spectrum as well. Some people have some English capacity. Some people have a lot. Some people can only write in English. Some people can only read in English or not speak it. And so, where you might show up, and I'm not sure if my mouse is showing, but where you might show up is somewhere along this spectrum. And so we want to take a second and think about where we are on this. Um, but yeah, it it begins to help us chart out what our own experiences are as well as what the experiences of others might be. As we do this, another way that I've experienced on this particular chart is being male. I've talked about it several times. Um, it's what's not on here is like height. I'm a tall black man. If I take black out for a second and just talk about being a tall man, We know that most CEOs of companies are over 6 feet tall. I'm 6'2". We know that men are typically looked to as trusted leaders. For me, as a man, I can go into spaces and speak. I can go into stores and shop. And when I say things, people believe what I say. I have literally sent my mom into stores with the exact script of what to say, what to get, where to get it, knowing all the things. And when she does the same thing that I could do, even as a child, people would question her. People would say, "Well, why? Why are you sure you need that? And what are you going to do with it?" And they do all these questions that I never ever have gotten. When I go to speak places, I've had co-panelists get asked about their degrees and where they got their education, and nobody ever asked me. And nobody realizes that I actually didn't graduate college, because men typically don't get asked the same questions that women do. We don't have to prove ourselves in the same way that women do. And so, this is one of those areas that I do experience male privilege, where I don't typically experience the same kind of oppression for being male or being seen as male. Carrie, did you want to add anything, or do you want to go to the next slide?
I just want to point out that from a practical perspective, we're not going to take the time to reflect on this personally in the workshop today. But the way that this works would be for you to take the time to kind of plot where you see yourself on each of these lines, and also acknowledging that these are not the only lines that exist. These are the ones that were researched for this particular book when it came out. Um, and so you would notice kind of maybe some of the lines don't apply to you at all. Maybe some of the lines, you sit on one side of the horizon or the other. So it's a way to kind of get a constellation, and kind of look at privilege and oppression, or privilege and resistance as a constellation. So we're not going to do it for ourselves, but next slide. We are going to look at the life of Jesus. And we're going to look at his identities and where his identities place him in positions of privilege and oppression. So go ahead, Darren.
All right. And just checking, Carrie, do you have your annotation feature on? We're going to try to mark some of these out, and give us one moment.
View options, right?
Yeah,
Nope,
under
I don't see
more.
the option. Do you have it on yours?
Um, Actually, I don't see it either. You're not seeing it on yours?
Nope. Asa, do you have it on yours?
Sorry, what am I looking for?
Annotation. There might be an option under the three dots where it says more to be able to annotate or yeah, to do
No,
annotations on a share. No?
not on mine either.
Okay.
Okay. Not the end of
So
the world.
we're going to use our imaginations together. Thank you, Asa, for checking. We're going to use our imaginations together. And as Darren and I talk through the different identities that we understand that Jesus held, we're also going to ask for some participation. So get ready to get back in that Q&A feature. But we're going to invite folks to be thinking about how to map Jesus's identities into this chart. Recognizing that this is a contemporary chart, recognizing that some of the features are not going to line up exactly, that this is a modern lens, that we don't know all the things that we think we know. The knowingness of who Jesus is a bit limited because of history and time and space. And so we're also going to spend a little time with some spiritual imagination here. Darren.
Yes. And I just want to acknowledge a comment. Someone shared that they have a masculine voice, so they talk to companies and get on the phone on behalf of other family members, so that they get a better response from like technical support and so forth. And that's a great example. Their voice gets read a certain way, and so they are able to access certain things and leverage that privilege on behalf of a family member. So I think that's a great example. So here in this, let me see if this helps at least a little bit. So here in this in this slide, we're able to see some of the things. One of the things that we noted was that Jesus is male, or perceived as male, or was identified as male in that society. So on this horizon, that means he was in the privileged position. Could Jesus, the Christ, have shown up as a woman? Yes, but in that society, the things Jesus was doing, the customs that Jesus was challenging, a woman could not at that time challenge those things or be in position in the way that Jesus was. And so we would put Jesus over here on the horizon to show that Jesus had that privilege of maleness, to the best of our knowledge. This also means that binary gender is part of this conversation, where we do know that the rabbis of the time did have as many as 5 or 6 ways to identify gender, but the society was still built in a binary: men are on one side, women are on the other, and so forth. And Jesus, within the binary part of that, was identified as male. Um, we know that, again, for circumcision purposes, and the way that rabbis were kind of also doctors at the time, that they had more ways to identify intersex and so forth, but their society still worked on that binary. So Jesus was in the privileged side of that. He was also a Hebrew. So in this particular instance, Jesus being Hebrew means that he had the highest esteemed level when it comes to your genealogy and your history. Because he was Hebrew, that also gave him access to say certain things to the religious leaders of his time. Him being, oh, I have moved to a different slide. Him being, um, him also being able to read, being literate at the time, meant that he could engage in scriptures and then engage in what was happening with the teachers of the law and so forth. So these are two more examples of him having privileges at the time. Carrie, do you want me to do the rest of the privileges and you take the resistances?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Jesus, and this is going to be a fun one. We're going to circle back in a couple ways. Jesus was trained as a carpenter. We typically see that. And so, one way to look at this is he had a skill that meant he could earn money, that he was trained in a certain craft. And so he wouldn't necessarily have to struggle for finances before he started his ministry. That's just one way to look at that. We typically read Jesus as heterosexual. There's lots of room for debate about what that means, but in his society, for him to have the access he would have had and so forth, it's a pretty safe bet to read him as heterosexual. Again, very modern lenses being put back on an ancient time and filling in blanks that we don't know. But we know that if he'd been identified as something other than heterosexual, he would not have had the privileges that were afforded to men in his time. We Another way of us reading back into history is we read Jesus as able-bodied. We read him as not being sick or chronically ill. We also read him as neurotypical. These are these are things that definitely would have disqualified him from things like serving in the temple, disqualified him from uh, from having full freedom in his society. And so Jesus being born into a body that is neurotypical and that is able means that he had access and privilege in ways that people that he healed, for example, did not. He was young. This is another one that can be read in more than one way, but because Jesus was not old, because he was of a certain age, that's another thing that tends to privilege his ability to travel, his ability to be seen as maybe a threat, but he was young. And lastly, he was a part of a majority religion. Him being Hebrew, amongst Hebrews, meant that, or amongst the Jews, meant that he wasn't seen as an outsider in that way. He was somebody whose lineage, whose religious practice, all those things meant that he was qualified to the people that he was trying to reach and impact. Carrie?
Yeah, so if you think about kind of this mapping exercise that we're doing, and you think about each of these spectrums, the idea here is that Darren just highlighted all of the places where we could map Jesus above the horizon into spaces of privilege, whether that be close to the horizon or into a very privileged place. That's a question mark or a series of question marks. But when Darren and I were discussing this, we kind of placed him above the horizon for all of those areas. So I'm going to invite, before we get to the oppressions and resistances, I'm going to invite folks to jump into the Q&A. If you have any thoughts about what we just shared, specifically if you want to disagree with what Darren just shared. If you have any disagreements for Darren, go ahead and drop those into the Q&A. We're just going to take a moment to get that started, and then I'm going to go into the oppressions and resistances. And yeah, I really like already we've got folks talking about how we're taking a contemporary lens and we're projecting it backwards into time. And so yes, this exercise is part of that imagination. Maybe not, this moment is not a spiritual imagination, right? It's a mapping imagination, but we're looking at the ways in which we function in position within society, and we happen to be looking at that for Jesus. Thank you for that comment. So as you start to think about where you disagree with Darren, go ahead and drop that into the Q&A. Meanwhile, I'm going to go ahead and start to talk about some of the places where Darren and I think that Jesus fit below, or parts of his identities were perceived or experienced below the horizon. And so one of those ways is, yes, he was a Hebrew amongst Hebrews, but he was a non-Roman. So he was not a citizen. And so when you think about the larger oppressive dominant space that he was living in, the governmental structure that he was under, as a non-Roman, he had way less privilege in the larger society. He was from a region called Galilee, which multiple times we see in the Bible was sort of scoffed at or let go of or not paid attention to or ridiculed. So his regionalism affected him or impacted his perception to his own people. Attractiveness, we don't really know. If you look at the spectrum of attractiveness, we don't know where he sits, but Isaiah's pretty clear that maybe he was not the prettiest of all the men. And then there's things that we absolutely don't know. We don't know about colorism. We don't know how that was perceived in the beginning of the Common Era. And there's a number of historical records from that time that actually look at how colorism was not that important then, but there's not enough for us to make a judgment there. And then the fertility line is also a big question mark. There are traditions that believe that he was fertile. There are other traditions. The majority tradition is that he was not fertile. So that line might not impact him at all, or it might have impacted him, but those stories did not come in to the Bible, or the Bible that we know. Darren, I would like to tell you that even though Jesus was trained as a carpenter, that did not put him in an artisan class. What do you have to say about that?
There's a great thing to talk about there. I grew up seeing Jesus as a carpenter, a skilled artisan, making these really expensive tables that you would sell on Etsy. And then somebody said Jesus was a day laborer. Jesus was more like the handy guy who would work around the building and work for cash. He was the guy who shows up at the construction site and does all this work, but doesn't have all the certifications and the accolades that come with being in a more privileged part of our society. And so that really made me think a whole lot more because, as people have mentioned in the chat, he was in an occupied state, right? He was in a society that didn't see him and his group of people as the top. They were the bottom. And so it's very possible that Jesus as a carpenter is Jesus the day worker or the day laborer, not Jesus the Etsy millionaire.
Awesome, thank you. For folks who are not reading the Q&A, there's some discussion happening right now in the community around if whether or not Jesus was maybe intersex, the perceptions of his place as a non-Roman, as a Galilean, inside the minority religion or not Roman educated, um, the age and the age that we get to know him and kind of where that age fits into the larger perspective of age in the time. And then some language, some conversation about language and the ability to be literate and within which parts of society would that have privileged him or not privileged him. So definitely keep chatting in the Q&A as well.
Yeah, there's some great stuff going on in there. I think I want to make some acknowledgments that I don't want to move past. One of the acknowledgments that I want to make is about bisexuality, about pansexuality. One at the conference, yes, it is very underrepresented. I think LGBTQ community in general does not handle bi and pansexuality spectrum very well. It's something that we are looking at, and how to make sure it's more visible and more included. But and when we look at Jesus's orientation, if he was asexual, if he could have been bi or pan, if he was, you know, what, there is no literal way for us to discern what Jesus was, short of asking him himself. And until we have the opportunity to do that, we are taking a lot of liberty in exploring this topic and exploring it together. So feel free to have strong feelings one way or another. This isn't your Sunday school class where we're telling you what to think. This is an opportunity for us to do an exercise where we examine what we think and hopefully make life choices that are a result of that examination.
Yeah, really good point. I think some of the aspects of what you were just saying, Darren, and what's been coming up in the Q&A is this idea that we've been given a stereotyped version of Jesus based in the dominant narrative, based in the dominant culture. And in most cases, that's based in a white I can't say that word, patriarchal,
Hegemony. Yeah.
thank you, culture, where we're kind of taught that it's easy to be with this Jesus, right? That he's
Hmm.
peaceful, that he's educated, that he's a skilled artisan. He was a good Jew. He ushered in a way of peace and love, which is not the full narrative. And it's not a bad narrative. It's a great to know that those aspects of this person that we're asked to sacrifice for and emulate. But then there's also this kind of question of across time, how do we grapple with who the real, quote, quote, real Jesus might have been?
Yeah.
So some aspects of that real Jesus was dark-skinned. He's a native of a part of the world that is not looking like me. That he might have been lower class, a gig worker, a day laborer, that he might have had an accent, that the region that he was from, was problematic potentially, that maybe he was ugly the way Isaiah talks about him. Maybe he was angry. We see him have these outbursts at times. Was he sexy? Is there a whole part of his life that we don't get to see at all about sexuality or sexual presentation? And I think he was anti-establishment. I was not taught that in any place other than my own reading, but the stories seem to support that. And as we know, in society where we are, being anti-establishment is not typically appropriate. And so that would have been taken out of the dominant narrative as well.
Yeah. And there's a rich history both in art and storytelling that we tend to see characters according to our own lens. And so by that I mean we see Jesus according to like how we're experiencing the world. I love the way that enslaved Africans in the United States saw the liberation stories in the Bible as hope and giving them inspiration to persevere, to endure, to resist. But others don't necessarily latch on to the liberation stories because they weren't in a place to need liberation. And so again, if you're really focused on the liberation, you would see all the liberating points as you read through the narrative. If you're not focused on the liberation, you're seeing the peacemaking points in the story, or the points where he use violence against his oppressors, those kind of things. And so again, we're just exposing these lenses and how we see who the same story, all these things can be true at once, but realizing that we show up to these stories with a certain lens. Okay, are we ready to go to the next slide? Okay.
All right. So here we're going to look at the being that and ask the following questions. How did Jesus leverage who he was to make change in his world? How did he walk out that change? And what can we learn from that? Okay. So take a look at the next slide. Sorry, Darren, I didn't do that well.
No worries.
Take a look at the stories that are on this slide. And for those of you who are familiar, you just need to be familiar with one of these stories, but maybe you're familiar with several of them. Darren's going to read them in just a second so that for folks who hear and remember and hear better, you'll have that opportunity as well. But for now, as you look at these stories, picture one or more of them in your mind and think about where Jesus leveraged his identity and what do we understand about Jesus's values through any of his behaviors that show up in these stories? Darren.
And I'll just read the names that we have listed on the screen, not in necessarily in order. The money changers at the temple, the woman who gave her last coin, letting Lazarus die and then resurrecting him, the woman at the well, healing the centurion's slave, feeding the masses, multiple stories, the Garden of Gethsemane, and then we gathered a few into Jesus' outstanding women, Mary, Martha, and others.
So as you picture one, just grab one situation and you can drop into the Q&A which one you're thinking about and then how you saw Jesus enact radical love, leverage his privilege or his identity, or show his values through his behaviors. And as we see those come in, we will highlight them as well.
In our ongoing acknowledgments of just also acknowledging there's a fun thing that's happening with the Q&A where the newest questions come in at the bottom, but as soon as someone hits like on it, it jumps up above the older questions that are there, um, which is okay. It just means that there are things that we might miss because we're either looking at the top or looking at the bottom. I'm trying to scroll and do both, but just wanted to make that acknowledgement so no one felt intentionally ignored.
Thanks, Darren. Yeah, our hack for creating community here is only it's as limited as it is, but I think this is great.
Yeah.
So some of the examples that are coming forward in the temple, Jesus using his physical strength and status as a male hero to overpower those who were wealthier and had higher status. Someone else said also about that scene, not getting thrown out or beaten for cussing people out in the temple and tossing tables. So if you've been watching the news in the United States in the last week, there seems to be a similar disparity happening in this country about whose bodies are protesting and the reactions to that, or for whose bodies protest and resistance is happening, and the kind of larger structural reactions to it.
You ready to start maybe talking about some of the ones that we've been thinking about?
Sure, absolutely.
So, yeah, you mentioned the money changers in the temple. Um, healing the centurion slave often comes up in LGBTQ spaces because there are the questions of what is the relationship between the centurion and the slave. Without getting way into details, some would say that this was a Jesus healing the property of someone without necessarily disrupting that system of that this person was enslaved. Some people would say that historically speaking, that the relationship between the centurion and the slave would have been of either a sexual one or a forced sexual situation. Again, depending on how we read context and consent and ability to consent, and that again Jesus was somehow prioritizing the healing of this person over the social implications of what that situation was. um, but in either way, it was unusual for Jesus to show up and heal. It would have been seen as unusual for Jesus to heal on the to the benefit of their oppressors. The centurions were the people keeping them under oppression, and Jesus is showing up and healing. And whatever this messy situation is, Jesus is showing up and healing there. Oh, I keep using the wrong. I use my swipe to do that. Okay. Carrie, do you feel like talking about Lazarus?
Yeah, sure. This is a fascinating story to me for a couple of different reasons. One, because of the relationship that he had with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He was close to that entire family, and publicly close to both sisters. Um, but the moment when Jesus gets word that Lazarus is dying, and then that he is actually dead, Jesus is close enough to be able to travel there and heal him before he dies. So Jesus has the opportunity to do what's expected of him in society at large. Um, and then he doesn't at all. Like, he completely undermines the expectation. Um, and eventually he finds himself at Lazarus's house. And when he gets there, he takes the time to mourn, knowing that he could have saved Lazarus. He still stops, gets present in the moment with the sisters, and again, publicly mourns in a way that is culturally countercultural. He's publicly mourning with women in a space. And then after he's present to that moment and present to them in this like amazing mercy, then he resurrects he resurrects Lazarus, and like completely turns the whole rest of the faith situation on its head, right? So like there's all of these complexities in that story. Darren, you were particularly taken when we were brainstorming about this around the kind of being present in grief together. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, just to think about that, right? That the God of the universe decided it was important to be seen, to even be recorded as having wept with those who are weeping. We live in a society that constantly tells us that we need to keep on, keep strong, keep going, no time for rest. Again, Western US society applied in your own context. But I've often seen us that men need to be strong. But I love that somehow, in God's foresight, Jesus wept is a line in the Bible, that we did not get the presentation of the God who's in flesh who did not weep. And so for us to have that to hold on to subvert the ideas of what masculinity is supposed to be, to challenge these narratives of what it means for, many of our churches, especially in evangelical spaces, are God triumph, 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 win. And it's like Jesus wept before he went and raised this man from the dead. Like how significant is that in us thinking about subverting narratives? for the one who had all power, or however we conceive the power that Jesus had in this human flesh, yet still deciding to weep. Another one that somebody mentioned in here is Jesus with the woman caught in the act of adultery. I love that it gets preached so often that it's like she was caught in the act and she was the only one who showed up for the stoning. Like, how did that become a thing, right? And then Jesus using whatever means to cause all of them, instead of focusing on her sin, to think about their own sins. That Jesus used his male privilege, that he used his perception as a teacher of the law, or as somebody who could interpret the law. He used all of that to then ask them to reflect on themselves, and then to as a final act choose not to not to condemn her either. Um, it's yeah, there's some real power there. Before we definitely want to unpack the woman at the well. Did you want to get to any other ones before we do that, Carrie?
Yeah, can we just spend a moment with feeding the masses? Um, so there's a couple of folks have responded to feeding the masses in the Q&A, and there's different ways to read those stories. There's the this was a complete miracle, and when the child had the fish and the bread, that Jesus miraculously made the magic basket that made all the food keep coming, right? So there's that version, which is awesome. And I am all for the magic basket. If that was a thing that lived in my life right now, I would be very happy. But then there's also the read about, which I think is equally as powerful, the idea that Jesus could motivate and his followers, the kind of inner circle, and then the next sphere of inner circle. So, we've got him in the 12, and then we've got the 50 and the Roman women that traveled with him. And again, talking about counterculture. And so you've got his kind of larger inner circle, this idea that he could motivate a people who are generally in a sustenance living situation, except for or living on the grace of and the funding of these Roman women. And then there's the masses, all of these people who are definitely don't have funding and don't have food and came out for the day and were unprepared. To be able to move them out of a mind of scarcity, out of a mindset where they could see their own need, and into a place of sharing, and into a place of provision, or and into a place of abundance, that is, to me, just as much a miracle as the magic basket version. And I think that level of care and consideration in as a leader for what's happening for the people, all of those stories are kind of unintended moments. They didn't plan to have a conference, right? It's not like they planned to have a conference and the food vendor trucks never showed up, right? Like, this isn't the situation. The situation is that this is a spontaneous gathering. This is one of those like Insta dances in the park. And then all of a sudden there's a lot of people here, and he takes ownership of the need of the people in a way that I think is pretty radical.
Absolutely. Again, from the comments, people are talking about how he engaged with both Mary and Martha. I love what I'm seeing there. I'm seeing some people challenging, whether he would have been perceived as educated or not. There's a lot of room, and this is why we have so many denominations and so many interpretations and so many places. It's not that any one of these is explicitly right or wrong, and yes, there is truth, but the challenge is that we all show up with a different set of lenses. We all show up looking at it from our unique perspectives. And so, if I were to let me find an example. If I were to show up and say, "What does this look like?" You might say, "It looks like a black square. It looks like this." And my camera to focus on it just looks like a black rectangular piece of plastic, but you haven't seen my perspective, which is it's actually a remote, and it's colorful, and it's got buttons and all these other things. And while neither one of us were necessarily wrong in our perception, we had different perspectives. And until you have done some time to walk around and see the other perspectives, that makes a huge difference. And so when we talk about Jesus with the woman at the well, we're talking about some things that, from the perspectives we have, we know were pretty radical. For Jesus to be talking to a woman, for that woman to be at the well at that time of day when it wasn't when all the other women have been there, likely meant that she wasn't in a high social standing. And later on in the story, we hear that she was with somebody who wasn't her husband, which, again, in that context, meant she would have been seen as immoral, that she would have been a woman that people would look down on, and that for this high popularity religious figure to be spending time alone talking to her, Billy Graham rule, for him to spend time, and the Billy Graham rule, for those who don't know, is this evangelical idea that men should not have any time alone with women that aren't their wives. And it creates all kinds of problems, especially for us queer folks. Uh, but Jesus was bucking all kinds of traditions, and so we see Jesus show up in a way that challenges his disciples, the people who were closest to him. It challenges the people of that town. I'm not telling this in a very ordered way, but I love the fact that Jesus speaks to this woman, challenges everyone's expectations, then tells her to go tell the town, which effectively makes the town all begin believing and following. So Jesus sent a woman to be the preacher who saves a whole town. We're still arguing about women in leadership in 2021. But Jesus gave this beautiful, unquestionable, in my opinion, example of how to use your privilege to benefit those who were all kinds of counted out in the context that he was in.
Awesome. So we're going to move now from looking at the life of Jesus and these examples that we've just been kind of talking about and deconstructing, and thinking about ourselves. What does it mean for us now to be that? The being that in the framework, just as a reminder, is the way in which we enact ourselves in the world, the way in which we take our authentic selves and our values and the things that we've healed from all of the challenges of our inherited environments, and then go ahead and enact in the world. And so the questions that we have on here, Darren's going to walk through them in a second, but the questions that we have on here are the ways that he and I started framing this conversation as we got this workshop together.
Yes. So what I hope is obvious from this, from the orientation of this workshop, is that we want to figure out, how do we walk like Jesus in our time? How do we walk like people who have both privileges and oppressions? How do we walk like people who are in a society that we've inherited things that we didn't choose for ourselves, but somehow we need to use and respond in a way that is God honoring and life giving to ourselves and those around us? How do we see ourselves? I'm of the opinion that we are created in the image and likeness of God, that Jesus definitely was God, but still walked as human. And so there's a duality there. And again, going back to Father Richard Rohr, he didn't do a dualistic kind of thing, where he was like, well, the God side, the human side. It was like, no, I'm both, and I am that I am. And if we are in that image and likeness, what does it mean for us to be I am that I am? What does it mean for me to be both Christian and gay? What does it mean for me to be both male and have male privilege, and black and have anti-blackness as a everyday reality in my life? What does it mean for me to be cisgender and to naturally be included and privileged over non-binary and trans friends and siblings? What does that mean for me to live a life that's like Jesus? And this next question that is crossed out is my personal thing. What does the social justice movement of today look like for contemporary Christians? Sometimes, and this is sometimes syntax, but sometimes we get into this idea of the social justice movement as if there's a single thing that's happening that someone started and is in charge of, and that if we just tell that person or those people what to do, that the social justice movement is going to go in a certain direction. And while I get the perception, especially if you look at history, how, like, we'll talk about Martin Luther King as the leader of the civil rights movement, or we'll talk about Gandhi as the leader of his movement, the reality is that social justice is always about the people, for the people, working together collaboratively to make change happen. And so while we'd love it for, or at least in our heads, we'd love it for there to be someone in charge, this isn't a single movement. These aren't single objective outcomes that we can list in 3 bullet points. Black Lives Matter is a leader-full movement. The water protectors who fought, those folks don't have a single person. And in the same way, yes, your church might have a single pastor, or yes, your neighborhood block club might have a single president. For us to change the world, it's going to be all of us working together with the power that we have to do it. And so, as Christians, we won't all have the same priorities in doing this work, but as the body of Christ, we all have a part that is absolutely critical to the body being healthy. So, don't feel like you have to walk away from this today figuring out what we're all going to do. Figure out what you do and do well, and do that to the glory of God as all of us in concert work together. I'm preaching.
It's good. So I think then the questions that we came up with as the two focus questions, which relate to the being as much as it relates to the being that, is how do we understand our callings to be instruments of grace and defenders of the outcasts? Um, and if Jesus said that God's way is present to us now, it's not framed as a question on here, but if the kingdom of God is at hand, what does that look like? How do we live out our callings, even though we live in violence and under oppression? And our violence and oppression might look quite different than the Roman Empire, which, in my opinion, was the most violent, oppressive peace state that the world has seen, at least in the last 10,000 years, but not necessarily more violent or oppressive than individual governments or individual states since then, just as an amalgamated state, I think it was, which tells you that our vision of Jesus and who he was and how he stood up in his world, I think in some ways that heightens this idea of resistance, or that heightens this idea of what were the stakes for Christ, living in that large systemic oppressive space. So again, how do we understand our callings to be instruments of grace and defenders of the outcast? And so we're going to come to that question um, by thinking about our own lives, our own being as, thinking about the ways in which we show up in the world. So maybe, Darren, we go to slide 16 and pose the question from the chat.
Cool. I just want to also name something real quick. And again, we're fully acknowledging that we come from an American, or U.S., I should say, centric lens of this. There are others who live in and come from cultures that are different, but I do want to challenge the American way that we love individualism, and we kind of distance ourselves from collectivism. Um, Many Asian countries and cultures, many uh, Latinx or Latine cultures do it, many African cultures do it, where the collective is much more prioritized than the individual. And we often see less of the oppressive kinds of things that happen until colonialism gets introduced. But I want us to be moving toward this idea. We just finished celebrating Kwanzaa, this idea of Ubuntu, which means collective. Uh, it's collective cooperation, working together. And so yeah, I want us to be thinking about how we work together as we continue on. And I am jumping to slide 16. so we can reflect as we have a few minutes left. Go for it.
Yeah.
Let me do this part.
Okay.
Um, the other part of what I want us to resist from a often Western, often white or European centric, often American ideal of, okay, how do we fix it? Give me my marching orders. We got to go do it right now for the glory of God and for victory. No, I want us to lean into the Eastern practice of sitting with a problem, thinking about it, meditating on it, feeling how it feels in our body, becoming mindful of all the stuff that comes up. Because again, our culture has often told us we need quick fixes, we need instant fixes, we need to fix it right now. And I know many people who are probably in this gathering are wondering, well, okay, we talked about all that good stuff, but what are we going to do about it? And while it's natural and we've been socialized to think that way, I want us to take a big pause. I want us not to hurry up and fix it. I want us to instead think about learning what the problem is. I want us to understand the problem really, really well. And then I want us to listen to those who have been doing the work for way longer than we have. I want us to listen to those who are around us and understand that no matter how charged up you are at this conference or at this particular moment in this workshop, that you exist in a community, you exist in a family, and that they aren't on the same page. And that no matter how charged you are, for us to go far, they'll have to go too. And so if we run out to do it all by ourselves, we can get some stuff done. But imagine how much more we can get done if we do the work that it takes to involve our communities, that it takes to involve our circles of influence, that it takes to speak into the board that you're a part of, to speak to the team that you serve on, to speak to your pastor and the elders and the leaders at your church. This isn't just about you going and being a good person. This is about us being the body of Christ, and that we would be part of God's kingdom coming here, or kingdom coming here, depending on what language you prefer, that we would be a part of that becoming real in the earth in whatever ways that we can be a part of it. So we want you to do that. We want you to think about those places you have influence. We want you to, if you feel comfortable, name those places that you have influence, and feel free to read those comments. You might not think you have any influence, but then you see somebody say something else, and you're like, "Oh, I could totally do that." So let's take a moment of silence, maybe a minute or so. Think about that.
So one of the questions that's come up in the chat a few times that I think really is at the crux of this question about what does it mean to be that? What does it mean to find this next natural step for ourselves? Also has to do with, but what about the people who don't see this Jesus that we've been talking about? What about the people who don't see Jesus as radical, who don't see Jesus or don't see their own projections of Jesus and the privilege and the stereotypes that they've placed on this kind of idea of Jesus? What about people who don't understand their privilege or don't understand this, the way in which we would like to see Christianity represented, as welcoming, as embracing, as caring and careful? And so we've got just a few minutes left. We'd like to go ahead and open the chat up and then also let you all know that the Whova chat, and it's actually going to be called chat, not the Q&A section on Whova, but the chat section for this workshop we're going to repost that same question, the question of what do we do for folks who don't see Jesus in the ways that we've been kind of talking about him, or don't understand the being that, or the showing up the way that we're talking about it, to continue that conversation. I just said a whole lot of things. So the question is to drop into the Q&A for the next little bit of time before we close, is what do we do about folks who don't see Christianity like this now? What do we do about folks who don't understand their own privilege? What do we do about folks who don't see Jesus as radical? So go ahead and drop your thoughts about that in the Q&A here in Zoom. And then we will open up the chat in Whova to continue that conversation. So let's take a minute or so about that, and then we've got a closing activity before we get to 5 o'clock. And so Darren, just as we're thinking about that question, there is a lot to ponder, but the kind of question specifically about what do we do with folks who don't recognize their privilege? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I'll be real transparent. I've spent the last 20 years doing work where I go into spaces that often are not in agreement with each other. And I show up as somebody who's trying to be a resource and be helpful, and to help people see other perspectives. And while I've had some amazing, effective moments of people transforming and changing, one thing that I only realized in the last year or so was that some people do not want change. They see change as a threat, and they will work to eliminate anyone and anything that represents change. Those people I can't reach because to them, I'm too much of an outsider. And so, in that case, the people who are most affected by me are people who have questions already, and they sound like people who don't want change. They look like people who don't want change. They sit in the same positions as people who don't want change, but they've had something happen in their lives where they have a question. Often it's something like a child or a spouse came out, or they're questioning their gender identity, or maybe they've had a sudden loss where life doesn't make sense with all the neat packaged answers. And in that place, they're asking questions, and they're looking for alternatives. Those are the people that I spend the most amount of time and energy with. Those are the people that, again, you'll find them in some other spaces, but you really have to keep an eye out, and listen for those who are asking questions. For everyone else, for the people who don't want change, the most that I can do, again, this is my understanding, the most that I can do is live the best life that I can, to do what the Bible says about being a living epistle or a living letter. Um, I can live a life that lets people know that as I'm a Christian too, and I'm queer, and I'm an activist, but you can't deny my Christian life. And in those cases, I let my life be a testimony to them. I'm going to keep saying what I say and doing what I do, but I'm going to spend the most time working with people who do have questions about change. And Carrie, feel free to add anything or share your own stories.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the answer is showing up. We've got this question about what does it mean to hear from God about what's next? What does it mean to follow the Spirit about the next organic, natural step? And so just in closing, I know that we're at a little after 5. We're going to do this in silence. Just take a moment if you would like to and drop into the Q&A spot any thoughts about your next step. Is there something that's coming up for you that's an emotion or a feeling or a thought word or an idea or an inspiration about what's next feels like to you? And so we'll spend a few moments in silence for that, and that'll serve as our closing prayer. So go ahead and take time to read what other folks are submitting as well.
And because we will close in silence, I will switch us to a screen where you can get more information about what we're doing to live this out in QCF. If anyone would like to be a part of that, use your if you have access to a smartphone, use that to screenshot the screen and get that QR code or that web address. Otherwise, feel free to message Carrie or myself, and we'll make sure that you get connected with the information you need to help QCF live this out.
So thank you for coming today, and feel free to drop your information into the Q&A about your next step and read each other's and then log off when you feel ready to.
And thank you to our tech team and our interpreters. We love you.